Hello, everyone. Today we're going to look at yet another book. This book is called Oversea Under Stone. It is written by Susan Cooper, and it is basically children's literature within the fantasy genre. This book is, in my opinion, a very fascinating read. I guess I have these weird memories linked to this book because when I first read it as a young girl, I think I found it in the library. My mom was a bit iffy on it because back then, my parents were a bit more strict about what we were reading. She wasn't sure, but I tried it out. And while on the surface, this book is uh, very accessible to kids, and it's kind of like a cross between Chronicles of Narnia meets Enid Blyton. There was this aspect of it that kind of gave me the willies, very similar to when I was reading The Never Ending Story. So I'm going to get into this book and what I thought when I revisited it recently. So this book was actually published during the 60s, which in my opinion, I think during this era we had a bit of a renaissance in terms of bringing fantasy out of the closet, because for a long time leading up to J.R.R. Tolkien, fantasy was really kind of shoved into the nursery. It was kept to, the realm of little children, much like how people think anime is just for kids because it's cartoony. And Tolkien and Lewis and George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton were huge proponents for fantasy. They really believed fantasy was necessary. And this was combined, bizarrely enough, I think, tangentially by Jung at the same time, who was coming out and saying, look, everyone, we need myths. We need to access our dreams as a way to process certain things that are going on in society and life. So Susan Cooper, I think, is a direct outflow of this Renaissance, and she basically was a contemporary of Madeleine L'Engle and other very famous authors and authoresses like Ursula Le Guin and so on and so forth. So Susan Cooper is one of those writers, and like I said, in my opinion, when you read her book, you're thrown back to this era of Enid Blyton. So you have these British children, on holiday, and they're having this adventure. There's a bit of a mystery. So the mystery aspect, I think, is what, for me, lends itself more toward the Enid Blyton scope of the mystery genre, right? But there is this additional aspect of this spooky, mysterious creepiness that's linked to Arthurian legends. And so there is another aspect of fantasy happening, even though in the first book, it's not as obvious as most other fantasy novels would be. So let's get talking about this first book. I'm going to be rereading the sequels, but for me, just offhand, let's do a very general, non-spoilery review of the book and whether you should read it or not, and then I will get into the spoilers. So overall, I think this is a very interesting read if you are into children's literature, if you like fantasy, and you want a super easy read, then this is an interesting book to get started on. It's not very big, and it's written, at this lower level that is still quite high because, of course, Susan Cooper was writing in the 60s, so literacy was at a different standard back then. So, yes, it is, a little old fashioned, but it's not that old fashioned. And so I think it's a very easy read. I think I could probably read this in a couple days, maybe even a day, really. But if you really want to take your time with it, I think it would take like a good week. It's very, very straightforward in terms of the characters that are involved. We have 3 children, Simon, Jane, and Barney. They have a dog. They're on vacation basically in Cornwall, which is a standard location for anything related to Arthurian legends. So this is kind of really tying into King Arthur and the Holy Grail. Now, there are these forces that are touched on in the book But don't go into this book expecting to see magic, or obvious magic anyway, or to see anything that is like related to fairies or magical creatures. This book is written like a mystery novel, but it has this odd, fantastical angle to it that I think is very fresh in that way, because it's a different approach to fantasy than you would ordinarily see. I think that overall the children are pretty, you know, diversely written. Their siblings, their interactions are very, very natural. There is this homey comfiness about how they interact with each other and their dog. You have, Jane, who's a fusspot, Barney, who is more flighty, and Simon, who is a bit more grounded. So you have these kinds of different personalities interplayed with their mysterious uncle. And of course, we have the bad guys who, in my opinion, are a bit stereotypical and strange. But, overall, I think this is a great book to read if you just want to try out some classical literature that was more common in the 60s. I can't believe I'm saying that classical literature could be coming out of the 60s. But I guess, like, if we were going to look at a subdivision of classic literature and think about children's literature, I think Susan Cooper's books would find their way in there somehow. So, overall, highly recommend if you want an interesting read, slightly creepy read. And that's all I'm going to say for the non-spoiler review. Just check it out, see if you like it. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed it. Like I said, it's an easy peasy read. And if you're going to read it to your kids, I would recommend the kid be 8 to 10 years and over. I would not read this story to younger children. And depending on the mental, the mental sensitivity of your child, you may want to push this book back to 12 or 13. And let's get to spoilers to talk about why I say that. Okay, so when I was a kid, I read this and I was creeped out. And I never understood really why. So I reread it recently because I was just curious. I was like, oh man, I remember that one creepy book I read. I wonder why I thought it was so creepy back in the day. So I started reading it again. And guess what? I got the heebie jeebies again. And there's like no real reason why. Like I still am not sure why. I just get the heebie jeebies from this book. Okay, so let's get to like some of the finer points of where I'm kind of getting the heebie jeebie, and kind of maybe see if as I'm talking, maybe I'll somehow like come to some realization. But the first thing that's very fascinating about this book is that basically, I believe their uncle is heavily teased to be Merlin. Okay, so that's kind of fascinating and that's really cool. And there's this sense of this dark versus light battle going on. And these kids are just tiny little pawns in this eternal game. And so that, I think, really starts amping up this low. So there's this low grade tension going on the entire time. And I think as you begin to realize what's actually going on, you start getting more and more tense. So in some ways, I have to say that if Cooper planned this, or even if she didn't plan it, I guess, it really speaks to her ability to create tension within certain kinds of readers. Now, once again, you might read this book and be like, oh, I don't see what the big deal is. But for me, it was a big deal. There is an aspect where they're trying to basically figure out the location of a mysterious treasure. And, when it's revealed to be the Holy Grail, it's kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now, this kind of mystery story is always a bit iffy because, the mystery is only going to be as complex as the writer is intelligent. In this case, you have to keep it simple because, the target audience is children, even if it is children in the 60s. And so basically, I don't think that the adventure in and of itself is incredibly complex and mind-blowing. But there is an aspect where they're waiting around at night, moonlight. It just comes off as being very creepy. I guess I'm just so into reading sometimes that basically I'm transported to that world. I create images when I read. And so I get this full IMAX kind of thing going on in my head when I'm reading. And if a book draws me in, if there's a minimal amount of technical issues, if I feel like it's not being super preachy, if I'm not noticing any kind of ideological drive to the narrative, I can be really sucked into these stories and I can start living in them. And at first, things are really hunky dory, but then there's like mysterious explorings at nighttime. There's like this whole thing about a tide coming in and trying to access a cave that's hidden by the tide. You know, as soon as you start mentioning caves and people being in caves, I just think about Internet Historian and the man in the cave thing, and I just get uh maybe that's adding to the tension, right? But I think the highlight for me is when they are looking around and they're trying to figure out a way to dodge the bad guys. And they're trying to also get their way to this hidden cave area or whatever. And it's really creepy. So it's around, I think it's around chapter 11 or something. And basically, they decide to kind of go down and try to do their next stage of exploration. But it is also on the day when there is some kind of a parade. Now, what is this parade? Well, it's some kind of British festival related thing, I believe. And it's really fascinating because it's clearly something that maybe North Americans might not understand as much, I suppose. And it's some kind of procession, okay? And so they're describing the procession, and the crowd is described in this way. Behind them, edged by delighted, pushing throngs of visitors, came a dancing file of the fantastic figures they had seen from across the harbor, the monstrous heads lurching and hopping in a slow parody of dance, and others, masked and disguised, weaving in and out of the crowds. Here and there they swooped on the bystanders, taking pretty girls by the hand, pretending to strike squealing old ladies with a ribboned wand, guiding the visitors and villagers to join hands and dance with them in rows across the width of the street. Pom pom de pom pom pom. The music boomed in the children's ears where they sat on the wall, and the crowds eddied all around them on the corner, overflowing up the hill as well as down. So you have this sunlight sparkling kind of atmosphere. You have this festival, this kind of procession, right? It's kind of like giving me vibes from the sounds of like how everyone's costumes aren't really related. They're not like matching. It's all very individualized and stuff. That it kind of reminded me of, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the film Paprika and the parade, but it reminded me a bit of the parade. And the one thing about that parade, as well as the parade in this one, is that you have this element of everyone's together, everyone's jolly, but at the same time, there's this underground threat. There's this silent but steadily growing sense of unease. And it's really kind of creepy. And basically what happens is the basically what happens is the three kids are separated for various reasons, and they're basically separated in the crowd, and Barney is alone. So chapter 12 is focused on Barney's adventure. And Barney is the youngest, and he is separated from his brother and sister, and he is basically pulled into the crowd, and he's looking at the crowd, and it says this: Barney could not see Simon and Jane amongst the dancers, and there seemed little chance of being able to get to them even if he did. He gazed fascinated around him at the bobbing giant heads, the bodies beneath them fantastic and gay in doublets and red, yellow, blue hose. Everywhere he saw costumed figures, a man dancing stiff as a tree, a solid flapping mass of green leaves, pirates, sailors, a hussar in bright red with a tall cap, slave girls, jesters, a man in a long blue silk gown made up as a pantomime dame, a girl all in black, twirling sinuous as a cat, with a cat's bewhiskered head, little boys in green as Robin Hood, little girls with long fair hair as Alice, highwaymen, Morris men, flower sellers, gnomes. Okay, so he eventually actually gets kidnapped by the bad people, who then take him to this really creepy guy who's sitting in shadow and is, oddly enough, symbolically enough, hiding out in the rector's home, because they have taken up a position of strength in the village with the aim to get this holy relic, the Holy Grail. And I think for some reason, like I said, by the time I get to this point in the book, I always really get this swamped by these heebie jeebies. And it doesn't matter what time of day I read it in, I just get creeped out. And I don't quite know why. Maybe it's because Barney is very young and very small and he doesn't really know how to fend for himself, and he's caught up in this huge procession of adults and kids who he doesn't know. Maybe it's because I just really feel wary overall about human processions and huge human events, and that always just gives me kind of like the heebie jeebies to begin with. But I think it's just this overwhelming sense of tension that's slowly building up, so that by the time he gets to the rectory and he's talking with the creepy guy, I'm just like, okay, I'm done. I'm going now. And so I had to actually put the book down and not read it for a week before I went back. Now maybe there's something else going on that I'm just subconsciously reacting to. I don't know. But for some reason, this book has always been very compelling to me. Not always in a positive way, obviously. And I think sometimes when I'm reading books, because I get so into them, it can be very disorienting and jarring to really vibe with the book on that level, to the point where you're freaking out yourself over what is really nothing. But maybe there's something there that I'm responding to. Maybe it's the sense of, where is Uncle Mary, Great Uncle Mary? Where are the others? Maybe it's this idea of evil being openly out underneath the bright sun. Because in that crowd, in that description, two people are described that are actually part of the evil gang. And they're in that crowd and they basically grab Barney. And so, in that description moment that I described, um, it's the sense of, there's this, there's this, there's this, there's this. And then you find out that two of those thises are not good, right? There's one that's not like the others. And it's this sense of being out in the open but unseen. And maybe that's what I'm vibing about. I don't know. You tell me, because if you've read this book, what do you think? Did you ever get like a creepy vibe from it? Maybe I'm just very sensitive. I don't know. But rereading it as an adult, I was once again impressed by how simple and straightforward these stories were. It wasn't really trying to make a point about anything. If there was any point to be made, it was that knowledge should be shared with all, and that, there's good and evil in the world, and that's about it. So it's a really great book in terms of having that more traditional approach to writing that's not as preachy, but at the same point in time, there is an aspect to it that is a bit more creepy. So if you have a very sensitive child in your life and you're thinking, oh, I think I'd like to read that with them, if they have any trouble with it, talk with them and see why they're responding now. Well, that's about it for today. And once again, if you have read Oversea Under Stone by Susan Cooper, let me know in the comments below what you thought about the book. Did you read it when you were a kid? Do you remember much about it? And just Let me know what other books you'd like me to review or discuss. All right, that will be it for today. Have a good one.